I want to say it like very clearly. I think people who use the term deserve your vote, or she needs to earn my vote, or she deserved to lose, I believe that to largely be either confusion or weasel language. When you say you don't owe anyone your vote, well, what do you mean by that? If what you mean is legally you don't have an obligation to vote for someone, then that I would say I agree. You don't owe anyone your vote in the sense that you are not legally bound. You haven't made a commitment that is enforceable. If the other sense is like, do I have an ethical obligation to vote for someone? Then I think you do owe her your vote because you owe the most viable, in my opinion, like the least harmful, viable candidate your vote.
Hey folks, please like, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to check out my newsletter. Information is in the description.
On Friday, I had another debate with Tim Pool, and he always likes to organize some help for his side, to have additional conservative people to lean on, to maybe be a contrast to. He did it previously in each one of the appearances that I've made, starting with Good Logic, then Will Chamberlain plus Alex Stein, then Matan plus Gavin McInnes plus Alex Stein, and now with this, I don't even remember his name, Joel guy, and this British person that they brought on to discuss the deployment of the National Guard. I always enjoy being outnumbered. I think optically it looks good for the liberal whenever they're outnumbered like that, and it gives me a lot to like push off of and to make like a useful contrast. And oftentimes there are disagreements that you can utilize between Tim Pool and the people he is bringing on. My strategy in that discussion was I expected him to bring up some like crime statistic or to bring up some anecdote, which he did. He brought up this story from like Chicago where apparently they tore down a neighborhood, and he presented this like false dichotomy that I have to choose between bulldozing all the black people's homes or a bunch of National Guard people picking up trash.
Oh yeah, look at this. That's where black people used to live. Look at all these houses. They fucking destroyed, and because instead of saying we want to deal with the crime, they went in, evicted all of the black people, and ripped their homes down. There's not going to be a single Democratic politician who's going to come out and tell you, because crime got so bad, we flattened the black community. They're not going to say that.
Yeah, but why are we playing this game of whataboutism when we're like, okay, the Democrats had a bad policy on crime. By the way, they've had multiple bad policies on crime over the course of decades and decades and decades.
It's not whataboutism. It's quite simple. The Democrat policies, the liberal plans, the plans you're presenting, and the counter that you're making to Donald Trump has failed.
And that couldn't, I think, have been a better thing for him to start with, as far as I'm concerned. I think that dichotomy is so preposterous. It's so ridiculous that anyone would accept that in a discussion about whether the National Guard deployment was justified or not, that we would have to choose between an illegal or unjustified bulldozing of people's homes and the National Guard deployment or military deployment. That is, like, to me, self-evidently absurd. Now, I've been told that what he said about that Chicago neighborhood isn't even true, but it doesn't even like really matter for present purposes. Like, just the fact that he is trying to contrast the National Guard deployment with some like other thing that happened in his past, I think it's self-evidently ridiculous. And I think that any like fair-minded audience will see the kind of gamesmanship that he's playing by contrasting those two different, like, very disparate policies against each other and trying to make a conversation that's like specifically about the deployment of the National Guard on like your broader solutions for crime. And so I thought that was a good look. Additionally, I think that like bringing on some insane Christian nationalist who basically says, what did he say there? He goes, all trans people are ticking time bombs designed to kill Christian children.
But what do you think about saying that transgenders can't buy guns?
Yeah, I think that that's ridiculous, right?
Why?
Because the Second Amendment protects people's individual right to own guns, right?
Yeah, but what if they're a biochemical engineered ticking time bomb to kill Christian children?
That is also, I think, a nice contrast with myself. And then he being unable or unwilling to like condemn that system of government, that theocracy, or at least to kind of make a false equivalence. Like, you want this shit, you want to bulldoze black people's homes, and he wants a Christian theocracy across the whole country where we're like outlawing blasphemy. Who can really decide between those two things? Again, once like, you know, mischaracterizing my position on housing and what I want to do to various different populations. So I thought that was all well and good. I think always when I have these conversations with Trumpers, I start with, do you care whether or not the policy at issue, whether it's deporting Kilmar, whether it's getting rid of Mahmoud Khalil's green card, whether it's deploying the National Guard or Marines and military, whether that is legal or not? That's how I always start with, because I think it's a great indicator of where these people's minds are at. In the case of Joel, he literally repeated the thing that Napoleon said or whatever. He who saves the country commits no crime or doesn't break a law. And that, again, I think is wonderful. And when they get back to those hypotheticals, like, well, you would break the law sometimes, yes, but we're talking about in the American context. We're talking about a threshold within the American context. And I think that all makes them look like authoritarian goons. I always will go back to the use of specific terminology in one case versus another. In the case of like the insurrection application of that term and rebellion, where he's like, oh yes, the burning of the Waymos and like throwing some rocks at ICE officers, that's definitely an insurrection and rebellion because it was so organized. It was really organized. And so unlike January 6th, which was very unorganized, that the LA protest riots, though, that was a rebellion, but not Jan 6 because it wasn't organized enough. Don't you know, I saw like a grandma walk in and they charged her as though that fact were related to whether we're going to use specific terminology for one event versus another. I think that's a good look as well. It shows the inconsistency, the hypocrisy. He's quite willing to call something a rebellion the minute Trump does. He's quite willing to call it an insurrection the minute Trump does. And anytime there's a specific opportunity to press him on that, I will take it. Because Trump is essentially running his administration off of emergencies, executive orders, and unlocking authorities based on like certain prerequisites such as insurrection, invasion, rebellion, that stuff. And so anytime the administration can be needled on their hypocrisy, be Jan 6, I'm going to do it. Other issues that came up, the British guy, you know, was I a little rude to him by saying, listen, you're from the UK, you don't know shit about the First Amendment? The reason I brought that up was specifically because he was suggesting that whether you wave a flag of another country, that is the determining factor of whether something is an insurrection or rebellion. I'm like, dude, you don't know jack shit.
Mexicans were waving their own flags inside your country and declaring that they were going to take over a state for the race. I think that probably qualifies.
Yeah,
that is a problem.
You know, it's funny that we have a UK person coming here to talk to me about the First Amendment, not my country.
Hold on.
That's why we
in this country, we have a right to expression. And also, by the way, I think it's even...
He's got you there.
It's even extra funny. I just want to finish this and I'll let you finish. So it's even extra funny because the whole purpose that our constitutional structure and history is so fearful of standing armies has to do with British deployments of the military in the United States for like the Boston Massacre, etc. And so, yes, we don't need your lessons on military deployments or the First Amendment.
Okay, there's no need to be petty. I was actually going to ask you a question in very good faith, so I would rein that in, please.
On this issue of the National Guard deployment or the military deployment, we were trying to get away from like your military standing armies deployments in the American context when we had the Declaration of Independence and charged that as one of the major crimes of the British Crown, which justified secession. So I thought that was a nice little opportunity. And he was kind of left with just kind of complaining about my being rude to him for the rest of the conversation and was essentially a non-factor. I think anytime someone is focusing on the meta of the conversation, that looks good for me, I think. They look like they're complaining, like they're whining. Tim Pool was interrupting, I would say, more than usual. And I think that he was more frustrated and guarded than usual. I sensed that. Another, I think, fantastic moment was near the end where he's like needling me on, isn't it a ridiculous question to ask if you have a preference for one race or another in terms of voting? I don't think it's ridiculous. First of all, we started this whole conversation with the British guy where he was like, I do think we should have a lesser standard for detaining black people than detaining white people. You can listen back to the actual conversation and you can see where he says that. Now, he tries to back away from it later, but I ask him a direct question, would you have a lower standard for detaining black people than white people? And he said, if it saves lives, of course. That's what he said. You can watch the tape.
Would you be okay with, for example, there being a lower standard to stop black people than white people go?
Yes.
So you're in favor of, so just to be clear.
Yeah, if it saves people's lives, yes.
Okay, so you're in favor of black people having a lower standard of stop than white people. This is where this kind of thinking gets. So when you ask, like, is this fascism? This is the kind of fascistic
it's not
thinking.
Fascism.
I do want to make
hang on. Sorry, Tim. I have to. It's not fascism.
So it was completely, I think, his own issue that race became a big talking point of the conversation. That's on him. And later he tried to back away from that and it's like, oh no, we're just noticing things. We're just noticing things. But I mean, you're not just noticing things. You did apply a different constitutional standard to black people than white people. You did suggest that. And you were trying to bait me from when I noticed that, like, yeah, there are some red states with with more crime than some of the blue states where they're proposing these deployments, even in the major cities. I mean, Chicago is not even in the top 10 in terms of crime. He goes, well, why are those red cities dangerous, or why do they have so much crime? And he wants to bait out of him, oh, because black people live there, because black people are inherently more, prone to crime. I think that's what he's pushing for. He struck me as someone who's like very anti-Muslim and very against immigration into the UK. And so that it kind of striking me as a kind of Tommy Robinson type outlook. I'm not saying that he agrees with everything Tommy Robinson does, but just in his outlook vis-a-vis immigration. Other parts of the conversation. Oh, I thought it was very revealing that this Joel guy was like a presuppositional type person. These guys are like dime a dozen. We need to have like some kind of dialogue tree to deal with the presuppositional folks, because it's so hilarious. And I was almost baited into having that conversation, but it's the same kind of people like Andrew Wilson who try to claim that like logic doesn't make sense without a God. God is objective, and without God, there can be no logic. The rules of logic and reason don't make sense absent a God, which to me is basically an unintelligible statement to make. And it's like very easy to make quick work of it. So he almost baited me into those presuppositional conversations. But I wanted to stay on message and stay on the point of the deployment, which frankly, we spent a lot less time on than I wished. If there was one thing that I think having even a little bit more discipline would have been better. I thought my demeanor was decent. I think my demeanor is always better in the studios than in the live audience context. You guys can tell me what you think. Some people, I saw some comments being like, you were too nice. I don't know the best way, and this will dovetail into my recap on the PrimeCayes conversation, the best way to deal with that critique. Because on the one hand, I get the critique, which I think is well-meaning, that you come off sometimes very shrill and too aggressive and too angry sometimes. And I think that's true. But then there are some people who I think in certain contexts wish I was like more harsh. And there were some people who felt that with the Tim Pool conversation, and there were certainly some people who felt that with the PrimeCayes conversation. Now, if you ask me my personal opinion, I thought that I was reasonably harsh against both of them. I mean, I am basically calling Tim Pool a dumbass authoritarian fascist guy, and I'm calling PrimeCayes complicit in that as well. And so I don't think that we can make the argument anymore that Pisco is going to treat lefties differently than MAGA people in the sense of it, like in the debate context optically that much, right? Because optically, I feel like I come across as congenial in the Tim Pool conversation a little bit, though I'm pushing, right? Constantly pushing, constantly asking him questions, pressing him. Same thing with Prime. I think it's about me finding my balance, perhaps, and how to approach these conversations. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you think that I was too nice to Tim or to the other people there, or to Prime, which we'll get to in a second. But I'm happy with how that went. I almost wish we had another hour. And it's not about like making sure I get invited back. That's not why like I would say anything that's on my mind. It's about me trying to get to the right tone, perhaps, to be like the most effective in that moment. But I'm open to the criticism there. I had a couple snide remarks under my breath that people caught. But in general, yeah, let me know what you think in terms of the topic discipline, in terms of the optics discipline. Let's talk about the Prime conversation substantively. So Prime is someone that I like. And similar to Tim Pool, behind the scenes, Prime and I, very, very friendly. I'm very friendly, again, with people like Crystal Ball, very friendly with a bunch of the other different people who, we think differently on issues. But in general, I like Prime. We have a big disagreement on the merits of the election issue. I actually didn't know / forgot that he didn't vote for Kamala. I thought it was going to be a conversation largely about like chorus stuff, but it very quickly got off like on harm reduction, voting for Kamala type conversation. And frankly, it's a little bit of the same song and dance that you guys have seen among a lot of these leftist circles for years. Although this one was a little worse. Because say what you want to say about the Vanguard, they voted for Kamala. Say what you want to say about Hassan, at least people say that he voted for Kamala. Say what you want to say about Crystal, she recognized that it was, in retrospect, should have voted for Kamala. Say what you want to say about Kyle, same thing. So this is like almost even a worse version of that kind of lefty anti-democrat sentiment, which some versions of I can even sympathize sometimes with people who are like, we don't like the Democrats when they're doing XYZ. But this was really just super synthesized, hyper concentrated version of what I would call lefty brain rot, even though I do like Prime quite a bit. So of course he's going to have a problem with Chorus if in general he has a problem with voting for Democrats, I think. Not suggesting that Chorus is a partisan organization in the sense of being officially affiliated with the Democrats, but everyone kind of understands ideologically the kind of creator is more center-left than full-on leftist, full-on socialist or whatever. And so it got into a conversation about why it was not okay to vote for Kamala. And then it kind of gets down to the trolley problem, doesn't it? Where PrimeCayes takes this like kind of like, I think like hard to explain, perplexing deontological view that one must never vote for the lesser of two evils, regardless of the consequence down the line. And that is like a kind of deontologic value that I could never truly understand. I mean, our minds just think very differently. It, at some points, feels a bit like a virtue signal.
It's not about, so my vote was not about who is better, a slightly lesser version of evil. It's, hey, are you for genocide or against it? Have you cleared that bar?
But let me run you down some of the I think problems with that conversation and what he's quote unquote trying to do in the conversation. Again, I'm not ascribing any ill motive to Prime at all. I'm just saying that these are the kind of patterns that I see in the conversation. The first is like this whole, well, she didn't deserve my vote. She didn't earn my vote. I want to say it like very clearly. I think people who use the term deserve your vote, or she needs to earn my vote, or she deserved to lose, I believe that to largely be either confusion or weasel language. I hear it from Prime. I heard it from Ryan Mullally. You don't owe anyone your vote. One thing that's been very helpful by talking to people like Avi and Ask Yourself is getting an understanding of what people mean by that term. When you say you don't owe anyone your vote, well, what do you mean by that? If what you mean is legally you don't have an obligation to vote for someone, then that I would say I agree. You don't owe anyone your vote in the sense that you are not legally bound. You haven't made a commitment that is enforceable, either in the law or I suppose socially, to vote for someone. So in terms of you don't owe, if what you mean by you don't owe someone your vote, as in like you don't have some kind of legal or promissory obligation to vote for someone, then yeah, I agree with that. But typically people mean something more. They don't mean that, right? They don't mean I have a legal obligation to vote for Kamala or I promised someone I would vote for Kamala. You know, that's not what people mean by the term owe. They mean some other obligation. Like you're not owing Kamala Harris a vote in some other sense. Well, what is that other sense? If the other sense is like, do I have an ethical obligation to vote for someone? Then I think you do owe her your vote because you owe the most viable, in my opinion, like the least harmful viable candidate your vote. If that's what we mean by owing someone vote. But like, what do you mean other than that? What do you mean by owe vote other than like ethical obligation to vote for someone? And once you start to clarify what is meant by these terminologies, this rhetoric starts to show its emptiness. The same thing with the kind of like, she deserved to lose. Well, what do you mean by she deserved to lose? And Tobias, Dr. Neerup says the best candidate is better wording. I would say the best viable candidate, perhaps. Because I wouldn't say like if you thought Jill Stein was the best candidate that you should vote for her. But so you have an ethical obligation to vote for them in the two-party system, the best viable candidate. But that's one area of like what I would consider, whether intentional or not, slippery or weasel language, you know? This kind of deserves to vote, owed your vote. Whenever you hear that, that should be sending like alarm bells. Because I think it's a way to like dodge the fact that everyone recognizes the lesser of two evils and to divorce that obligation that one would feel to vote for that lesser of two evils and to impose instead a kind of like candidate obligation. When we're not analyzing like the candidate's obligation, we're taking the candidate as given and assessing your obligation given a candidate. And so always be aware, I think, of that terminology. She deserved to lose. She didn't deserve my vote. I didn't owe her my vote. You don't owe anyone your vote. That is what I take to be kind of like weasel language. The second part here, and it's something that Joanna and I have discussed, where she's been super influential on my thinking here, because she's writing a piece on genocide and we've had conversations about it, which is this kind of like totalizing view of genocide. And this is going to sound perhaps a little bit callous, but I don't mean it as such. I actually think it's a really important point. I tried to bring it up in the conversation. I don't know if it was lost, but, and again, I don't want it to sound callous. Genocide is not the only thing that matters. Genocide doesn't even necessarily require anyone to die by its strict legal interpretation. There are genocides in history that have been less harmful than other things in history. There are other evils and harms that need to be weighed. I don't know why your rule would be prevent genocide or vote against genocide, even if the vote, if actuated, wouldn't save you against a genocide, and even if there are other massive amounts of social ills that will come about by your actualizing the preferred outcome. And what I mean is, like, how do you weigh the genocide of the Gazan people against millions of deaths of starvation elsewhere, which are not genocide, or millions of deaths due to disease? It's not intuitive to me that the only thing that we should care about, to the exclusion of other things, is death by genocide. Not to say that we shouldn't consider and weigh actual or supposed support for a genocide in our voting calculus. Of course we should. That's why, by the way, I would vote for Kamala. If anything, I think the genocide and what's happened in Gaza is more of a reason to support Kamala and not Trump. But even putting aside, like, why is it that you're a single issue voter on genocide? You shouldn't be a single issue voter on genocide. There are war crimes that are not genocide, that are horrible and sometimes even worse than a genocide, right? There's arguably certain war crimes or crimes against humanity that, taken in their totality, regardless of whether there's that intent, the genocidal intent, you would consider worse than a genocide in a given context. So I do think sometimes genocide bad, 100%. You should work to prevent genocide, no doubt. But it cannot be the only thing that you're factoring into your analysis. You cannot be a single issue voter on genocide. It is not the morally, in my opinion, what I take to be the ethically correct thing to do, is to vote on account of genocide and nothing else. That said, if you were only voting for a genocide or on the basis of perceptions regarding a genocide, obviously the vote is for Kamala. And I think it's the most revealing question I posed to him was, choose between not voting for Kamala and 20,000 Gazan children dying in voting for Kamala and 20,000 Gazans surviving. And he chose not voting for Kamala, even when there was 20,000 lives at stake. If you knew for certainty that Kamala Harris in office right now would like save the lives of 20,000 Palestinians, would you substitute her in for Trump?
No, I don't vote for people who support genocide.
So even if it would save 20,000, even if you put in 20,000 lives of Palestinians,
my friend,
you wouldn't. I mean,
because here's what
that is a level of deontological commitment that I truly can't understand. Like the thought of 20,000 lives being saved by your vote, and on the basis of your virtue signal, you wouldn't save those people. I mean, that to me is insane, and it's also counterintuitive to any kind of peace strategy, right? By that logic, why would we ever make peace between Israel and Palestinians? Presumably, any peace that's achieved would have to kind of like give both sides something, right? Some kind of mutual understanding, or where there would be some kind of concessions made to a genocidal state. Even the prospect of peace, achieving a peace, necessitates some amount of, in this context, compliance, acquiescence with a state that is responsible for a genocide. And so by that logic, like, why would voting and settling a position that way be some kind of like exceptional act which wouldn't be encompassed by negotiations between the relevant parties? You understand what I'm saying? So like, you're willing to say, I take this pure stance when it comes to voting, but given the choice to Prime, like let's say that you're the President Prime, and you're saying, listen, you can end the genocide right now, you can get peace right now. What you're going to have to do, though, is you're going to have to cede some land over to Israel. Or you're going to have to, we'll even get a two-state solution, end the genocide, but there just has to be mass amnesty for everyone involved in Israel, right? And I think, given the deal, a final settlement of final status issues, ending the genocide, saving the lives of the Palestinians, but full amnesty for any Israeli war criminal, I would take that deal. I think if you cared about the Palestinian people, you would take that deal. I understand it's not a true choice. I'm not saying that this is the actual choice that presents us. I'm saying imagine this were the choice. And I don't think you can call yourself a friend to the Palestinian people, especially when a lot of these deals are being proposed by the Palestinians themselves. Even Hamas, right? Hamas is offering deals. Well, you would never say, well, I don't make compromises on genocide. I couldn't make a compromise on a genocide. Of course you would have to make one in the context of negotiations. So why is there this kind of like vote exceptionalism where we have to be maximally pure with respect to voting, but can be decidedly less pure when it comes to imagined negotiations, imagined deals? Voting should be considered, and the election of a person to lead an effort should be considered part of that whole calculus. And absolutism with respect to voting, I think, is doesn't make sense. Why you would treat voting from everything else. So those are some musings on that portion of the discussion. On the actual napkin math, listen, I have seen some critiques of the polling done by this firm in conjunction with YouGov. I've seen that. I'm not going to tell you right now that I've spent a ton of time internalizing all those arguments. To me, it seemed like applying some napkin math to incorporate the amount of lost vote from 2020, which had much more people voting than 2024, in a way to like capture that lost vote and make the argument that different positions on Gaza would have changed that. But I think it just doesn't contend with the basic counter argument, which is you don't view the position on Gaza in isolation. You view the position on Gaza not just for what you could have gained, but what you could have lost. What you could have lost in terms of ideological pro-Israel people in the context of pre-November, right? And pre-Trump administration, now where the popular support has, I think, shifted way more to the Palestinians. But also what you could have lost in terms of looking like you're a disorganized mess, chaotic mess, criticizing your own president as like a genocide warmonger. That could have lost votes too. And so fundamentally, regardless of the methodology here, which I'm not going to pretend that I'm a statistician, though I did take a statistics class in my economics degree, I think that there's you're not considering what you could have lost. You can't just consider what you are likely to gain. And then I'm not sure that he's accounting for the difference in population, the difference in where the vote is taking place. So yeah, that's my response on the numbers analysis there. I don't know what I could do to reach someone like Prime on this issue. He strikes me as someone, if I'm being honest, who's not interested in being convinced. And having taken that hard of a line, I don't know what it would take to move him off of it. I think that's going to have to be a natural little thing that happens. But yeah. Oh, last thing on the Prime thing, and then I'll take your questions. The whole like shit lib thing. You're a shit lib. You're a shit lib. I don't really care. I don't like to get into the whole like, you called me this name, and so I'm going to like, I don't really give a shit. I think that is all part of the game. Remember when I called that guy a bitch? That tiny guy? Apparently he showed up to the Tim Pool thing. I didn't see him. Like, whatever. And I think focusing on the insults during the conversation, one, I'm never apt to do that. Unless there's a specific meta conversation we're having, I'm not apt to focus on that. I think it kind of looks like a bit petty. Why does it irk you so much that he drew a hard moral line at genocide? So, again, well, a couple things. One is, if there is a significant material difference in the candidates with respect to that same genocide, I think that's, just an issue I'm having with his deontological perspective there. Second, I don't think that my hard line is, if there is a significant massive difference, right? A significant massive difference. I guess those are maybe oxymoronic in this context. If there is a humongous, immense gulf between one candidate and the other, then regardless of if they're a criminal, regardless of if it's really going to affect the lives of people in a massive, demonstrable way, then the hard line is you vote for less harm. And so I do have, in principle, a problem with that deontological line, where I can understand a threshold for voting in the absence of a massive gulf between the two candidates that doesn't affect people's lives in a massive, humongous way, right? So I can understand saying, I will not vote for a sex offender, a murderer, a genocide supporter, given that the two candidates are very similar. I can understand that as a threshold. But when there's a massive, demonstrable difference between the two candidates, it's going to affect people's lives in huge, demonstrable ways, then I don't understand it. So I do have a problem with drawing any line in the context of a massive, huge gulf like that. So you're right about that. And that is any line. That's even the most gross lines that you can come up with. You know, and I might be calling for that person to be voted in and then immediately impeached, for example. I might be calling for that person to be voted in and then have them be disqualified some way, right? But yes, if it's going to be a massive, huge gulf between the two candidates in a demonstrable way, yes, I have a problem with drawing a line anywhere. Separate from that, right, is this kind of analytical line where we only consider the harm of genocide to the exclusion of other harms. So you have one candidate is like, all right, you're pro-genocide, and the other candidate is pro, like, not genocide, just like a pro-mass, I don't know, starvation on orders of magnitude worse. Right? Like, you're in favor of not genocide, but just killing the entire human race through starvation. It's not clear to me that the preference there would be for the mass starvation person. And having an analysis that has a genocide exceptionality to the exclusion of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Again, I'm not saying you don't consider that and war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I'm assuming most pro-Palestinian people are going to consider both genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Sorry, and genocide. So I'm not saying that most pro-Palestinian people only consider genocide. I'm saying considering only genocide, if you were to do that, and discounting the other harms such as mass starvation, mass disease, war crimes, crimes against humanity, institutional structures in your own country, the ability for you to help other people in the future, because now you live under a fascist tyranny. That only focusing on genocide is myopic. And I think it's kind of like emblematic of a moral confusion here. Oh, that's another thing I wanted to bring up. Great point, Firebomb. This whole like, well, my vote didn't matter. That's another, I think, slippery thing that people will say. Yes, in isolation, everyone's vote didn't matter. But we understand fundamentally what we're asking when we say who you should have voted for. We're talking about like the demonstrative signal, right? The signal value of your vote and what it says about your preferred outcome, right? So we're not really, when we say it was wrong for you to vote for Trump, we're not saying it's wrong because you could have affected the outcome. We're saying it's wrong because your expressed preference or lack of preference is the bad signaling value or demonstrates a lack of, or is unethical in terms of if it were actualized. So the question about it was wrong to vote for Trump, it was wrong to vote for Kamala, is not a question about the instrumental effects of your vote. It's not a question of did your vote actually change the outcome. It's about getting in the head of that other person if their preference were to be actualized and what their vote has to say about the signaling value or the internal value that one obtains from that vote. It's the other theories of vote value. And so getting bogged down in the whole like, well, my vote wouldn't have changed anything, it's kind of missing the point of the conversation. Yeah, granted, anyone's individual vote doesn't change the outcome. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is the actualized outcome entailed by your preference, if you could choose, and the associated values there. I hope that makes sense. That any kind of retreat to, I didn't change anything. Anyone could say that about any vote all the time. And so you voted for this person, it was wrong to do. It's a kind of shorthand for that other stuff, which is your express preference. I hate that you let Tim Pool frame the debate when he said Dems bulldoze homes. Why not ask for data? Because I don't want to get bogged down in the actual discussion. So this is a good question. I'm not mad at you, Set. I don't want to get bogged down in an actual conversation about the bulldozing homes. That's what he wants. Like, I just want to be like, I don't know, like, fine. Like, yeah, I would say this wrong. Can we just talk about what we're here to talk about? So in the moment, right? It's like me playing fisticuffs with ghosts. And for all I know, he's like properly representing the thing. So why would I take a battle on his ground where it's fertile and where he maybe has access to more of the facts and where I'm having to like look up and scramble in real time? And then that leads to me potentially making more mistakes. I will read Kick Chat, by the way. That leads potentially to me making more mistakes by saying, oh, here it says this. And then he goes, oh, no, you see, you fell for it. So I understand the frustration, but he's always going to pull something esoteric, right, out of his backpack. And I think the best thing you can do is be like, that's not relevant to our discussion, dude. Assuming that you're telling the truth, I don't think it has anything to do with what we're here to talk about. And it's not a diffusion of responsibility, right? Because how would I have prepared for this specific Chicago example? And to say that I'm diffusing responsibility or that I'm like not doing something responsible here, it's to suggest either I should have prepared for it or that it would have been preferable in that moment, other than to talk about like the deployment, which I'm prepared to talk about and where I feel like I'm very strong, to like start actually hashing out this thing I don't know about in real time, where obviously he wants to talk about this, right? It's an obvious bait to get me to be like, that's not true. The Democrats don't ever do anything bad. So you can disagree. I don't know that it's the optimal strategy to get dragged into a conversation that I'm not prepared to have. And I don't think it's irresponsible for me not to have prepared for that conversation, because it's always going to be one thing or the other, right? Do you guys agree or disagree? Please let me know. I can't believe you didn't prepare for Tim Pool's 3,000th random anecdote. And that was what I was trying to do, was debate him into saying that's just an anecdote when I brought up the whole, I was a bartender and everyone I talked to, and I know that's not an argument, but I'm just trying to show the audience that when he brought it out, I said, that's just an anecdote, dude. I think it's demonstrative of the way in which he argues. And it shows the kind of like ridiculous premise of what he's saying, which is essentially that we should change our mind on some disparate policy based on like someone he talked to or his neighborhood or whatever. I think he should have just said, I don't believe you, and hand waved it. Yeah, maybe from now on I could be like, listen, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't believe you, but whatever. Let's move on. If you don't know the facts, it's better to not engage. Right, like I don't want to, if he were to bring up, let's say I had no understanding of a particular, it's one of the reasons why debating anti-vaxxers, if you're not prepared, I think can be harmful. But one way to get around it is just be like, listen, you're wrong about this. I know you're wrong. Right now, I don't want to have a conversation. We're not here to have an anti-vax conversation. Because they've prepared some example. Don't you know that in 1942, the whatever vaccine did whatever to this one person here, and this one founder of this vaccine said that they're always unsafe to do this kind of like, and even the most like experienced vaccine debater, misinformation or whatever, can't reasonably prepare for every like anecdote or bullshit thing, right? It's a lot harder to swat down in real time. And it was also true, by the way, of the election fraud stuff. And even me, I read a lot about these election fraud cases. I went into the weeds here in terms of the evidence that was being brought. And sometimes someone would bring up something I hadn't heard of. 99% of the time it was bullshit, but like doesn't mean in real time. Sometimes I would indulge them and be like, let's look this up in real time. But it was hours and hours on like one thing, right? And in the context of a Tim Pool debate where I'm already 3v1'd, I don't know that it's the best look for me to try to drill down on that one point. It's kind of why I resisted the urge to go on the presuppositional debate with the religious guy. One, because I think I had a mission to talk about the deployment. And two, because that's kind of a debate he wants to have, even though I kind of wanted to have it too, because I like that debate. He's much more comfortable in there, right? And even though I have a curiosity for this, it would be a diversion, right? And it's his fertile ground.